This program is made possible through the support of Indiana Public Broadcasting Stations. Live from WFYI Studios in Indianapolis, the 2022 Indiana Secretary of State Debate, presented by the League of Women Voters of Indiana.
Welcome to the 2022 Indiana Secretary of State Debate, live from the studios of WFYI, Indianapolis. My name is Laura Merrifield Wilson, and I will serve as the moderator this evening. This debate has been organized by the League of Women Voters of Indiana, a nonpartisan political organization that has been encouraging informed and active participation in government for over a century. The League influences public policy through education and advocacy. We never support or oppose any political party or candidate. All three candidates on the ballot in Indiana were invited to participate. You will hear from two of them this evening, Democrat Destiny Wells and Libertarian Jeff Maurer. Republican Diego Morales did not respond to multiple efforts to contact him and his campaign. Write-in candidates were not included. The candidates have to agree to some rules set governing these debates. Each candidate will give a 1-minute opening statement, followed by questions from the moderator. The order for answering was chosen by lot, with candidates alternating throughout the debate. Candidate 1 will respond first. Candidates will have 60 seconds to respond to each question, although the moderator may ask for clarification and specify further response time. The debate will end with the final question, allowing for closing statements of 30 seconds. Candidate 2 will respond first to the final question. Our timers will make sure that we adhere to the agreed times. The candidates have not seen these questions in advance and have agreed not to bring notes for the questions. Questions have come primarily from members of the public. Only those relevant to the duties of office will be asked. And with that, we will open with our first question. Mr. Maurer, you have our first question for this evening. What do you see as the top policy challenge for the Secretary of State in Indiana, and how do you plan to address it?
Our top policy challenge necessarily has to be our election integrity. And so it's the sum total of all the details of getting together to make sure that our elections are transparent and accountable, and that we can all see the process clearly and have confidence, restored confidence in our elections. So we have to look at all of campaign finance law and all of election law to see those opportunities where we can make our elections more secure, more transparent.
Thank you. Ms. Wells, what do you see as the top priority for the Secretary of State in Indiana, and how do you plan to address it?
Well, thank you for having me tonight. The Secretary of State's office has multiple roles, but this year in 2022, post-2020 elections, the biggest policy challenge is running our elections in a free yet secure way. We live in the age of disinformation, and we have seen that transpire when the 2020 elections were contested, that the results were fair and accurate. It is the Secretary of State's job to make sure that we are educating the population as to our process in fighting this age of disinformation. As Secretary of State, running elections will be our top priority in addition to the other 3 divisions within the office. Additionally, Hoosiers are not turning out to vote. We are 46 in the nation in registered voter turnout. And so we want to make sure that while we are educating about our election process, we are also engaging the public and making sure that they are turning out to vote and making their voices heard.
Thank you. Ms. Wells, if elected, what additional areas of responsibility would you tackle?
So I mentioned before that we have poor voter turnout. The Secretary of State's office has a lot of latitude to engage the public and have civic education. And that is one of the priorities that I want for the Secretary of State's office. Additionally, the Secretary of State's office can show Hoosiers how the money outside of elections is influencing their process. We are last in the nation in our campaign finance transparency. And that is because we have statutes that have that really have no teeth in them, and so there's no accountability to the public. And we see millions of dollars entering our elections and being resulting in candidates being influenced as to how they are conducting their politics. And so we want to pull back the curtain on that as Secretary of State and use the tools in the office to educate the public on just where that money is coming from.
Thank you. Mr. Maurer, if elected, what additional areas of responsibility would you tackle?
The core focus has to be on election integrity. And so this is an opportunity. This election is an opportunity to restore confidence of Hoosiers in our elections process. And we can do this with common sense tools like receipts and audits. We can use receipts for each one of our votes, and we need a complete and independent audit of all 92 counties before the elections are certified. Together, these are the tools that will give us the confidence and the transparency to avoid the concerns of 2020.
Thank you. Speaking of 2020, Mr. Maurer, was Joe Biden freely and fairly elected President of the United States in that election?
Yes.
Thank you. Ms. Wells, the same question.
Unequivocally, yes.
Thank you. Ms. Wells, if elected as Secretary of State, how will you fulfill your responsibility that elections are both accessible to those who are eligible to participate and free from fraud and external interference?
Well, I would point Hoosiers to the over 50 cases that have transpired since 2020 that have shown that there was no concerted efforts of fraud on our elections. And so again, that is fighting the disinformation that is out there. At the same time, though, we need to be making sure that we are allowing for accessible elections. Indiana has some of the most suppressive election laws in the country. We have one of the earliest voter registration deadlines that's actually tomorrow, so make sure that you are registered by tomorrow. Our polling hours close very early. We have to have excuses if you want to vote by absentee. Our Republican opponent wants to take those 11 exceptions and limit them to 4. And so we want to make sure that while we are running secure elections, we are never compromising accessibility. We can do both. We can have fair and free elections and also safe and secure.
Thank you. Mr. Maurer, if elected as Secretary of State, how would you fulfill the responsibility, again, that elections are both accessible to those who are eligible to participate, but still free from fraud and external interference?
Unlike my opponents, I do not favor changing our current exemptions or requirements for photo ID. And so instead, I'd like to focus on receipts and audits. These are additional tools that will give us the credibility to know how our elections are performing. And the audits will show that our 92 county clerks are doing a Herculean effort, good work. They are understaffed, under-resourced, and overworked to execute our elections. They need more training, they need more resources, and they need more leadership from the Secretary of State's office to ensure that we have an opportunity to restore that trust through common sense solutions, receipts, and audits.
Ms. Wells, based on your stated priorities in each of your campaign websites, you have some overlap in what you'd like to see done. And either of you win the election, are there any specific ideas or policies from the other candidate that you might want to implement or perhaps even collaborate on?
Right. I mean, I would, yes, like to counter that as to
Okay, you have the opportunity for 30 seconds to counter.
Yes, as to Jeff's specific policy agenda item that he would like to run 92 county audits. This is also an item by the Republican opponent, Diego Morales. Indiana is already strapped when it comes to resources in conducting our elections. We have 92 county clerks that are doing a very good job. And if there are any, contested races, a candidate just has to ask for a recount. We already have safeguards, and we don't need 92 county audits.
Thank you, Ms. Wells. Mr. Maurer, I would also like to offer you the opportunity to counter for 30 seconds, please.
We may have safeguards, but we have red flashing warning signs that suggest we have problems with our audits. We have troubling footage of a county clerk who is seen entering in a bipartisan secured room. We have software used in the state of a company whose CEO was just arrested on sealed indictment charges. We don't know the security that we have, and the only way to understand what is working and what is not is to get a baseline assessment, and that is a complete and independent audit of all 92 counties.
Thank you. Based on your stated priorities of each of your campaigns, you had some overlap in what you'd like to see done. So looking a little bit differently here, if either of you were to win the election, are there any specific ideas or policies from the other candidate you would like to implement or perhaps even collaborate on? And I believe I started last with Ms. Wells, so we'll start with you, Mr. Maurer.
Sure. From conversations that we've had along the campaign trail, being available and in the public together, we have, I believe, a shared interest in ranked choice voting and a nonpartisan commission for redistricting after the decennial census. So there are areas of policy, and as the Libertarian candidate, I'm often asked, well, how will you work with other parties in office, with the General Assembly and with the governor's office? And as a third-party candidate, I can bring all parties together because I'm not loyal or beholden to any other party or to any other party chairperson. So it really is the perfect vantage point from which to make meaningful and substantive improvements in our election security.
Thank you, Mr. Maurer. Ms. Wells, I'd like to ask you the same question, if there's an opportunity for collaboration or any overlap in terms of policies that you see.
Well, there are 3 other divisions within the office aside from the election division. There is the securities division, the business services division, and the automotive dealers services division. And so Jeff and I have been on the trail quite a bit, and I think we have the same thought process when it comes to making sure that as Secretary of State, it is not an elected official who is constantly campaigning, but it is an official who is putting their focus on the office and making sure that it is customer service oriented and serving Hoosiers first.
Thank you. Ms. Wells, I'd like to start with you. You mentioned the other responsibilities of the Secretary of State, and I want to ask if the Secretary of State's office is budgeted and staffed appropriately to provide all the services that it needs to.
So the 3 other divisions, the business services division, the securities division, and the automotive services division, are functioning quite well. And that is a testament to the previous secretaries of state and making sure that they were focusing on those divisions. But since 2020, we have seen all this time and energy with the elections division. We see that we have an antiquated voting machine structure within Indiana. We have multiple different standards throughout our 92 counties. And what we saw in the previous session was that millions of dollars was budgeted toward what is called a voter verifiable paper audit trail that would be on top of direct recording electronic machines. It is going to take serious conversations with the legislature and making sure that we are bringing our machines online and we are not just sticking to the same systems that we have had previously that are not federal best practices.
Thank you, Ms. Wells. Mr. Maurer, I'd like to ask you the same question. If you believe the Secretary of State's office is budgeted and staffed appropriately for the services that it provides.
Our world continues to change. Think about how your life has changed since 2007 when the iPhone 1 was introduced. So the office needs to keep pace with technology and consumer preferences, and that means investing in new technology and investing in people who understand it and can manage it safely for us. So while the funding level exists now, it needs to constantly evolve with the needs of society and the needs of new technology. One of those focuses needs to be on the constant modernization of our elections. We need to invest in new technologies that allow both convenience and security, and we need to invest in a comprehensive audit. At the end of the day, when we count our votes the way we count cash, we'll finally get the elections that we deserve.
Thank you, Mr. Maurer. My next question will start with you. What area or division served by the Secretary of State's office should be a high priority for actions to support Indiana citizens?
For this perspective, I'd like to take a look at the securities division. And this division is involved with investigating securities or financial crimes. And so not necessarily stealing somebody's identity or issuing or asking for Target gift cards, but more complex financial crimes like selling shares to a fraudulent company. And this is complex and detailed investigative work, and the office works closely with prosecutors and law enforcement. But right now we have an entire segment of baby boomers, our neighbors, who have done everything right. They've worked hard, they've saved all their lives, and now they're trying to pass on that wealth to children and grandchildren. And there are fraudsters out there who will take advantage of that and try to sell them something that just isn't legitimate. So this office, or this division of the office, needs more resources and more focus to protect our most vulnerable neighbors.
Thank you, Mr. Maurer. Ms. Wells, the same question. Which area or division do you think should be a high priority for Indiana citizens?
I think every division should be a high priority, and I do have to agree with Jeff, and I think the securities division is a priority, especially with fraud that is committed against our older population, collection agencies that need that are a little bit too intrusive. And then also there are other divisions like the business services division. We have so many small business owners throughout Indiana, and they deserve great customer service. And right now they have inbiz.com, which was great when it started, but it needs to be inbiz 2.0. And so that division too, as far as affecting Hoosiers at large, needs more attention. And like I said, the Secretary of State's office needs to be in the business of governing and not just campaigning, as we've seen in the previous year.
Thank you. Ms. Wells, what are your views on ballot access for third parties?
Well, my view is that I'm here with Jeff. And so, you know what? We are a two-party system, but third parties, independent parties, also hold us accountable too. And so, you know, more than anything, I try to highlight that in Indiana, we are ran right now by a supermajority Republican legislature, Republican governor and agency. And so, not even more than just independent and third parties, we need to get back to a two-party system and have Democrats also involved in the process in keeping our democracy healthy through accountability in a two-party system.
Thank you, Ms. Wells. Mr. Maurer, the same question. What are your thoughts on a third party?
Well, think about a restaurant that has only one item on the menu and it's something that you hate. How often would you go to that restaurant? The answer is probably never. And so what we need in Indiana, what is really going to drive voter turnout and overcome the low statistics that we have as a state in performing for voter interest, it's going to be options. It's going to be a bigger menu of options. That means more parties and more candidates and more choices for you, the voter. And the way to achieve that is through more third parties, third, fourth, fifth parties, and to have more competition. When we see this in our environment, when we see two stores competing on the street, two similar stores competing on street corners, you get better quality and lower prices because there's competition. And we expect to see that same competition giving us better options on our ballot when we have more third parties who are actively able to participate in the political process.
Thank you, Mr. Maurer. I'm glad you mentioned voter turnout because that's the subject of my next question. Indiana regularly ranks among the bottom 15 in voter turnout, with about half of Hoosiers voting in presidential election and only sometimes up as 1 in 5 in local elections. Does this concern you, and how would you address low voter turnout if elected as Secretary of State?
Benjamin Franklin wrote to his youngest sister in 1773 saying, "If you become a sheep, the wolves will eat you." And that is what we have right now with low voter turnout. We have our citizens, our neighbors, becoming sheep voluntarily by not engaging to vote. So it's a responsibility and a privilege and a right to vote. It's critical that you get out and vote because we need your input for our shared future. And that means having more options and more competition on your ballot. We can't sustain the two-party system. If you're exhausted and frustrated with what we have, if you see things going the wrong way, if you don't know what the problem is or how to fix it, just look at where we've been. We've had two-party system rule for decades. And so if you want a different result, we've got to do something different.
Thank you, Mr. Maurer. Ms. Wells, the same question. Does low voter turnout bother you, and how would you address that as Secretary of State?
It absolutely bothers me, and it's been a large talking point for us on this campaign. When I started this campaign as a Democratic candidate, I was told it was impossible to win because the demographics of Indiana make it a red state. Today, we are 4 points up on our Republican opponent, and we have been going throughout the state saying that Indiana is not a red state. It is a purple state with a voter turnout problem. In 2020, when the stakes seemed existentially high, 1.6 million registered Hoosiers stayed home. And so it is deeply troubling, and we are looking at the reasons as to why Hoosiers are not participating. And there are multiple reasons, to include a couple decades of partisan gerrymandering that have drawn districts that make races not competitive, and therefore voters are not incentivized to come out. We need to work toward nonpartisan redistricting in 2031 to just begin to address our voter turnout problem.
Yes, Mr. Maurer, I'll offer you 30 seconds of rebuttal opportunity.
I don't see a turnout problem. I see a trust problem. And I can't tell you how many of our neighbors I've met out campaigning who say, my vote doesn't count, my vote doesn't matter, the system is rigged. And so what we need to do is bring back trust, and our opportunity here in this election to restore trust in our elections with common sense solutions, receipts and audits. That way, the confidence that your vote counts means something.
Ms. Wells, would you like 30 seconds to respond?
Yes, please. As Secretary of State, we must be operating from a fact-based, evidence-based place. And so, yes, we do have a voter trust problem, but that is because we have been living through the last years of perpetuating a big lie. When people no longer believe in the truth, then the biggest lie wins. And so we can't further add fuel onto the fire and say that your vote doesn't matter or count and that we're going to have a 92 county audit. We have to step back and actually start to educate voters on where the truth is.
Thank you. We're going to end it on this topic for a moment, but I promise you we will return to elections and voting. I want to know, given the other responsibilities of the Secretary of State's office, what changes you would like to see in either the Business Services, Security, or Auto Dealer Services Division, and why? And Ms. Wells, we'll start with you first.
I've sat down with with the technology vendor for the Secretary of State's office that helps with the platform inbiz.com. And so with COVID, what we saw was that we started to rely on web-based platforms because of safety measures. But now we have a Secretary of State's office that largely operates behind this web portal. What we need to do is we need to bring the technology up to date within the Secretary of State's office. And it's just not with inbiz.com. We can also do this with our campaign finance search functionality. We can do it with how you can register online. While the Secretary of State's office may not make laws like the legislature, it is able to shape the Hoosier experience by offering better tools through technology. And this is what I would want to do as Secretary of State.
Thank you, Ms. Wells. Mr. Maurer, the same question. What would you like to see in Business Services, Security, or Auto Dealer Services divisions?
In the Business Services Division, we have to remember that government exists to serve us. And so as an entrepreneur and as a CEO and co-founder of a VR tech company right here in Indiana, I've been on that side of the software. And so I know what it is to focus on payroll and product and service and customer satisfaction and cash flows. And the last thing I'm concerned about is the stack of paperwork from the government. So government needs to serve businesses, serve Hoosier entrepreneurs, and the first way to do that is to get out of the way. So to streamline things, make things easy. The second thing the office needs to do is to go and live where small businesses live. And that means weekends and after hours and places in the times and quiet moments that you have to focus on all the other things that aren't part of your business. So as part of my platform, I want to expand customer service hours, allow for texting, and assign a dedicated account representative to live with the startups as they grow, so that way there's enhanced customer service.
Thank you. I'd like to ask the candidates how well the Business Law Survey Commission serves a proactive role in maintaining a positive Indiana business community. And Mr. Maurer, I will start with you.
Sure. So history tells us that anytime there's clarity in a marketplace, we have people coming in because they know what the risks are and they can act on it. Having the legal infrastructure to guide us for what is acceptable and not is critical. Think about all of the new and emerging economies and industries that are yet to be developed. We can build them here. We have to have clarity around what that's like. So autonomous vehicles, medical device, medical tech, pharmaceuticals, hemp agriculture, cannabis companies, if and when cannabis is finally legalized here like it is in our neighboring states. So think about all the opportunities, the growth opportunities that we have. To have clarity around those laws and those industries will help our neighbors build businesses here. I'm not talking about spending millions of dollars of our tax dollars to bring in billion-dollar companies from overseas. I'm talking about helping our neighbors build the next billion-dollar company right here in Indiana.
Thank you, Mr. Maurer. Ms. Wells, the same question. How does the Business Law Survey Commission serve a proactive role in maintaining a positive Indiana business community?
Well, as an attorney, so I am also a government litigator. I have been an attorney for the last decade. To Jeff's point, the law is always evolving and always changing, and it is hard to stay informed as an everyday citizen. And so in making sure that we are messaging correctly, that we are giving updates, and we are allowing for the public to be educated and know how they are maneuvering through the business space, it is the responsibility of the Secretary of State's office when working with this commission to further that mission with the public.
Thank you. Ms. Wells, what changes would you make or suggest that the legislature makes in administering elections in the state of Indiana?
So when, again, running for this race as a Democrat, I have been asked, how does a Democratic Secretary of State work with a supermajority Republican legislature in administering elections? And so as a Democrat in a two-party system, I think it is imperative that we are able to work with a Republican supermajority legislature, but to also progress the needs of Hoosiers. So with accessibility, we need to start advocating for polling hours to go past 6 o'clock. Indiana is one of only 2 states that closes their polls at 6 in the afternoon. We need to advocate for less restrictive voter registration laws. Like, again, I said, make sure you register by tomorrow. And so as the Secretary of State, we need to be working with the legislature, but also making sure that we are informing the public when the legislature is not accountable to the needs of Hoosiers.
Thank you, Ms. Wells. Mr. Maurer, the same question. What changes would you suggest or what the legislature do in administering elections in the state?
All of our election law and campaign finance law is written by the 2 old parties. They wrote this together, and it serves to help them stay in office and to keep all others out of office. So it's imagine 2 schoolyard bullies writing all the rules about who has to turn in their lunch money. That's what we have. That's why we have so little competition on your ballot, why we have so few people running opposed with an actual opponent. So working with the state legislator, we're going to introduce good accountability, ease of access, transparency, things that make the entire election process more competitive. We have to take ownership in making elections more competitive for all.
Thank you, Mr. Maurer. I will allow a 30-second rebuttal from Ms. Wells.
I would like to say that as a two-party system, this is how our democracy has thrived throughout history, and that I would like to say that the Republican Party and the Democratic Party aren't bullies. The Republican Party is a party that has had no accountability in the state of Indiana for the last 20 years because of Republican supermajorities, and without accountability, you get a runaway party. When we are functioning appropriately, we do a good job. Both parties can have good ideals, but it takes the presence of both to keep each other accountable, which we don't have in the state of Indiana right now.
Mr. Maurer, I'll allow you 30 seconds as well for rebuttal.
Our system is not working. And if you're exasperated and frustrated and exhausted by how broken it is and how toxic it is and how hyper-partisan our elections, how angry they are, we can see proof of that by the fact that we are missing one of the candidates on the ballot tonight, so confident that he's set to win this election that he won't even care to hear what you have to say. Our elections and our systems are not working, and we can see that because mirror image states where Democrats are the supermajority power, like in Maryland, are just as dysfunctional as Indiana. So the duopoly is the problem.
Thank you, Mr. Maurer. If you're just tuning in, we want to welcome you to the debate, and I'd like to remind you that all 3 candidates on the ballot in Indiana were invited to participate. You are hearing from 2 of them this evening, Democrat Destiny Wells and Libertarian Jeffrey Maurer. Republican Diego Morales did not respond to multiple efforts to contact him and his campaign. And as the debate continues, I'd like to ask a question specific to voter registration. Mr. Maurer, I'll start with you. Where do you see the opportunities for improvement with voter registration, and what effect do you hope these changes would have?
Voter registration comes to, and being on the campaign, it's about engaging with young people. So working in high schools and colleges, people who are coming of age to vote, communicating out that parents can take their children with them into the polls and encourage them, show them the process of how to vote. And it comes back to giving them something to vote for, not just someone to vote against. That's been the problem of the duopoly. So to give a reason to vote for, we need candidates, we need competition, we need trust in our elections, and that's going to come from things like receipts and audits that give us that insight and the clarity to say that my vote counts. I can see it, I can track it just like a package, and I know that my voice has been counted.
Thank you, Mr. Maurer. Ms. Wells, specifically to voter registration, what opportunities do you see for improvement and what hope would you like to have?
Where I see the Secretary of State's office in the state of Indiana operating from right now is a place where they are afraid of voters, where we are afraid of registering the youth and the power of the youth vote. And so what we need to be doing is operating from a place where we embrace our potential voters, where we talk to college students and we talk about their individual voting experience, where we don't mire the information where it is confusing and people are unsure if they should be registering or how they should be registering. And also from a party perspective, we need to be engaging with the public and not just putting it off on a bunch of nonprofit organizations to do voter registration. It is a group effort from both parties and libertarians and community organizations to get out the vote and to make sure that we are getting individuals registered no matter who they are or where they live or what their politics are.
Next, I'd like to ask a question about the most important role of the auto dealership division. Ms. Wells, we'll start with you.
So it has, working with the Auto Dealer Services Division, there is a bit of a dynamic between auto dealers and the manufacturers. And what the auto dealers are wanting from the Secretary of State is to make sure that there is an equitable process between auto dealers and the manufacturers. Also, auto dealers are a great example of not being included in the conversation of when statutes are set. And so after the fact, auto dealers find that there are gaps in how we are making the sausage in the legislature. And so they want to be represented and they want to have that voice heard. And with that, there are other practical standpoints of delivering titles to Hoosiers in time and making sure that the Secretary of State's office is regulating that process. But it has been good to get to know the auto dealers throughout Indiana.
Thank you. Mr. Maurer, the same question. What do you believe the most important role is in the auto dealership division?
The Indiana Secretary of State's Office Auto Services Division is tasked with enforcing state law for the auto dealers industry. And much of that's just cut and dry. But where there's an area for real focus and opportunity is in the gray areas where there are challenging relationships between the franchise dealers and the manufacturers. And so when there are new requests that come out from the manufacturers, such as requiring additional personal data for customers and customer prospects, being able to adjudicate those and help dealers manage those relationships with the manufacturers, perhaps through administrative courts as one solution that reduces costs and accelerates solutions. That is one way forward. But this is a great example where our private markets recognize the importance and vitality of private personal data. And that ties into our election data and making sure that our voter and poll worker data and registration databases are all secure and private. If it's good for the private market, it should be good for our citizens and neighbors too.
Thank you, Mr. Maurer. I'd like to ask the next question to you first. Why is it necessary for the state to determine operating hours for auto dealerships, especially for those voters who may not be familiar with this process?
It's not. As a libertarian, I believe in free markets, and I believe that businesses know how to serve their customers best. So at the end of the day, one bad review on a website or a search report can cost an auto dealer hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost revenues. And so they know their businesses, they know their customers, they are highly, highly incentivized to offer outstanding customer service when customers want it. And so here's a matter where government should step back and listen to the industry for what needs they have and work with them to ensure that customers are served fairly and protected, but that the dealers are enabled to serve their customers as best they know how.
Thank you. Ms. Wells, the same question. Why is it necessary for the state to determine operating hours for auto dealerships?
Well, there's always a balance between having government regulation and then also, to Jeff's point, fair and free markets. And so with the hours that have been set, those hours have been around for a very long time, and that is where they have come out as far as allowing auto dealers the freedom to operate, but still making sure that we are protecting consumers.
Thank you. Ms. Wells, what is ballot security, and what, if anything, should Indiana do to safeguard it?
So much of the debate and questions that are around elections come down to security and how safe are the measures. I will say that in the state of Indiana, elections overwhelmingly have been safe and secure throughout the years. In fact, Indiana has great safeguards on the process. As far as ballot security, you know, as a almost 20-year now military officer in military intelligence with Army Reserve, a lieutenant colonel, a lot of my background is in information security and cybersecurity. Right now, Indiana is part of a cybersecurity program where it safeguards ballots, and so that personal information is not being leaked on those ballots, and then they're also not susceptible to outside attacks. I would look to continue those cybersecurity efforts and making sure that ballots are safe.
Thank you, Ms. Wells. And Mr. Maurer, same question. What's ballot security, and should Indiana do anything to safeguard it?
Ballot security is being able to track your vote, to see that it was counted, received, and then audited, to be able to follow it through that process. Ballot security also means all the back-end technologies, processes, people, and protocols that ensure that privacy. And right now, we have these flashing red warning signs that suggest, yes, things are okay, but there are areas that we should tighten up. So if you've ever moved into a new home or a new apartment, you know one of the first things you're supposed to do is change the locks. Not that the last person who lived there is going to come back and steal all your things, but it's the right thing to do. It secures that vulnerability. And in our elections process, around our ballots, we have countless vulnerabilities, both physical paper ballots and even more in digital and electronic ballots. One of the most important things we could do is ensure that every ballot cast in Indiana has at least a paper backup. Right now, the minority, only 40%, have any kind of paper backup whatsoever.
Thank you. Ms. Wells, I'll offer you a 30-second rebuttal.
I would like to say that there has not been any evidence put forward that Indiana is not already protecting its vulnerabilities when it comes to cybersecurity and information security with voting. There have been multiple attacks, but the Secretary of State's office has put forward the evidence that they have encountered those and that they have dealt with them accordingly. That is why it is so important to be operating again from a fact-based, evidence-based place so that we are not perpetuating that there is a problem when one does not exist.
Thank you. Mr. Maurer, you have 30 seconds as well.
From a fact-based perspective, the Los Angeles County DA made an arrest of a CEO of a software company called PollChief, and this was this past week, and that software is factually used in Indiana. So we don't know the details yet. The indictment is still sealed. There are many details to come, but right now we know there's a vulnerability, and we know that there may be more out there. We have to investigate, understand, and ensure that we're working diligently to actively and aggressively secure these vulnerabilities.
Thank you. The independent state legislature theory suggests that state legislatures should have a more substantial role in regulating federal elections. More extreme versions would minimize the authority and duty of officials like the Secretary of State's office. Can you please share your perspective on this idea and the implications for the office? We'll begin with Mr. Maurer.
It's very clear from our U.S. Constitution that voting is a state's right. It belongs with us. And even within Indiana, it's said that we have 92 different elections because each county has a lot of discretion. They have a menu from which to pick, and it's the county serving its local needs best. The needs of Switzerland County are very different from the needs of Marion County, but if they all choose off a pre-selected menu that from the Secretary of State, that's the best way to serve the needs of each local community. The federal level and the federalization of our elections is tantamount to not only taking them from us, but also introducing all kinds of new vulnerabilities and new components that will complicate and stymie our abilities to choose our leaders.
Thank you, Mr. Maurer. Ms. Wells, the same question. Can you share your perspective on this idea and the implications for the office?
So the independent state legislature theory is just that, a theory. It is not doctrine. And so it will be heard by the Supreme Court this fall in Harper v. Moore. I want to go one step further than Jeff says about the ISL theory, though, and the problems that it could give individual states. It is not just about a states' rights argument. It is also about possibly cutting out states' the state judiciary and in its ability to step in and tell election officials when something is wrong. And so the ISL theory could be a very slippery slope. It has people talking about it all around the country. Again, it is just that, a theory. And it is actually very surprising that the Supreme Court is even taking it up, and I feel that people should be watching it with alarm.
Thank you. Mr. Maurer, I'll allow 30 seconds for rebuttal.
If you like hearing, I'm from the federal government and I'm here to help, this is your solution.
Thank you. Ms. Wells, would you like 30 seconds for rebuttal as well?
Right. I think our country has been founded on interaction between the federal government and the state government working together. You know what? I've served in the military, like I said, for almost 20 years. That is a federal organization, and I do not feel that I am an evil person because I served on behalf of our country and I was led by the federal government. I'm in fact very proud, and I think that we can work together for better solutions for a stronger democracy.
Thank you. Ms. Wells, we'll start with you on the next question. Can you describe the responsibility of the continuing care retirement communities, and could you address whether you think the division could do more to protect the consumer?
Right. So when there is a continuing care retirement community, they have to work through the Secretary of State for a one-time certification and making sure that they are doing all the things that they should be doing and having an adequate community that serves our older generation. And so with that community, we want to make sure that we are working with these communities, but also checking in on them, because like I said, it is a one-time deal where they are signed off on, but we could do better in making sure that we are checking in, especially when we know that problems arise because of the vulnerability of our older population and being taken advantage of.
Thank you, Ms. Wells. Mr. Maurer, same question about continuing care retirement communities and protection to the consumer.
Sure, let's talk about protection to the consumer, the residents of these communities, and in light of their vote and their ballot and ballot security. My grandmother lived in a facility like this for years, and she lived on the Alzheimer's ward because that's what she had. And so somehow, magically, some group had come through and taken her vote, taken her signature, and submitted it for her. And so we don't know who that was or what they voted for her, but there they were operating on the ward, an Alzheimer's ward of a senior or continuing care facility. That's an unconscionable abuse of their right, not only their right as a consumer, but their right as a voter. And to think about how my grandmother's ballot access was taken from her by some unknown group, that's what we need to stop. That's one of the many vulnerabilities that we need to address in securing our elections.
Thank you, Mr. Maurer. My next question involves voter fraud, and I want to know your opinion if it's a concern to Indiana.
Voter fraud happens all the time. Someone just reached out to the campaign because they thought they had voted, and it turns out their votes were declined the last 2 cycles because of some kind of transposition of a birth date. And so that's one simple version. We have nearly 1.5 registered voters for every voting member, and that means there are millions of votes that can be cast by people who aren't voting. Requiring a photo ID protects the non-voter, the person who can't or won't vote or chooses not to, because just like identity theft, it prohibits somebody else from taking your identity and stealing your vote.
Thank you. Ms. Wells, the same question: is voter fraud a concern in Indiana?
Voter fraud should always be looked at by the Secretary of State and made sure that we are doing everything that we can do to safeguard against it. But if we look again to history and to evidence, we see that as far as voter fraud, there has not been a large, organized, concerted effort of voter fraud for partisan gain. What we see, though, is that there have been isolated incidents of voter fraud in the past. I'll even mention an example. One of our Republican secretaries of state, Charlie White, was found to have committed voter fraud. He was prosecuted, he was indicted and sent to jail. And so we can deal with voter fraud when it occurs, but again, we should not be perpetuating that there is this huge voter fraud problem when we have no evidence to support it.
Thank you. Ms. Wells, what role should the Secretary of State's office have in training clerks and election volunteers in conducting elections in Indiana?
One of the things that I take the most pleasure in, or that I am so happy to have been able to do, was to sit down with the state clerk's executive board and to get to know them and their everyday mission. We have to remember that clerks wear multiple hats. As an attorney, I know that, right? I've gone to the desk, I've worked with the clerk. They have to also be there for the courts. And so with elections, that is not the only thing they are doing. They need support from the Secretary of State's office because they are the boots on the ground. And every time that a party or an actor perpetuates these falsehoods, they make the clerks' jobs harder because the clerks are the ones that are intercepting the phone calls of concerned citizens who have been led astray with mis and disinformation. And so when it comes to clerks training, we will continue forward how they have been doing business, but we will also make sure that we are supporting them every step of the way.
Thank you, Ms. Wells. Mr. Maurer, the same question. What role should the Secretary of State's office have in training clerks and election volunteers for the election?
The only falsehood is believing that everything is perfect. That's delusional. What instead we need to do is focus on making things better. There's proof that things aren't working right because in 2020 and 2016, both losers of those elections claimed that the other party had stolen or rigged the election. It's the process, it's the election that's failing us. A good election is one in which the loser accepts the results, not because they like the outcome, but because they trust the process. And so by that metric, our elections are failing us, not party, not falsehoods. So we have to focus on the training for our clerks, for our poll workers, for our election day workers, so that way they have the tools and the transparency to help all of us trust and restore trust in our elections again. Some of that, just imagine stepping into a new job as a clerk where you have to be the expert and maybe your staff is just one other person. We have to look to the clerk community and see other states to guide us for what that training should be, and then aggressively offer that and include that as part of the onboarding and for all of our election day workers.
Thank you, Mr. Maurer. Ms. Wells, I'll offer you a 30-second rebuttal.
I'm going to have to counter with validating people's beliefs that the elections were stolen and therefore their behavior was appropriate. It absolutely was not. We can't say that it's the process that's the problem. We have people who are acting irresponsibly, who are power hungry, and who can't accept results because they don't want to give up power. We have to face that head on and again, fight it with good information and evidence.
Thank you, Ms. Wells. Mr. Maurer, you also have 30 seconds.
We can fight with good information and evidence with a comprehensive audit, a top-to-bottom audit of everything that we do. Every ballot that comes in, every door that gets locked, every person that sees or touches the election process in one way or another. That is how we are going to dispel that kind of bad behavior by shining sunlight into dark places. We need a comprehensive, independent audit of all 92 counties before the elections are certified.
Thank you, Mr. Maurer. A recent study published by the nonpartisan Coalition for Integrity ranked Indiana 51 in terms of campaign finance laws, weaker than any state and the District of Columbia. What role should the Secretary of State's office have in improving Indiana campaign finance activities? And I'll start with Mr. Maurer.
Sure. So we saw it right here in Indiana. Our current sitting Secretary of State, when she was first appointed, violated campaign finance laws by soliciting donations at a time that was prohibited because our state legislature was still in session. Our campaign finance laws are complicated and written by the two-party system to make it complicated for everyone, and particularly for all third parties. So simplifying them, but also allowing for greater transparency so that way we can understand who our candidates are and how they're being purchased.
Thank you, Mr. Maurer. Ms. Wells, the same question, and that is asking what role the Secretary of State should have in improving campaign finance laws.
So the Secretary of State is essentially the campaign finance administrator. And what we see in like the study you referenced where we are 51 out of all states and DC is because it is a bit of the wild, wild west in Indiana when it comes to campaign finance. That's why Jeff and I's opponent bought a almost $44,000 car with donor money, but didn't have any repercussions. Our statutes have no teeth, they have no enforcement. And so as the Secretary of State and the campaign finance administrator, we can start to message with the legislature that we need to strengthen our campaign finance statutes, and we also need to make sure that we are holding especially candidates and committees and PACs responsible for what they are doing. You just can't file a report and say, I checked the box and I'm good to go. There has to be a bit of investigation and make sure that everybody is doing the right thing.
Thank you, Ms. Wells. The next question is for you first. How will you assure that all 92 counties in Indiana will follow federal and state voting laws in the same manner?
Well, so I believe that the 92 counties have overall done a very good job. It is not easy to be a clerk. It is not easy to be on the local election board, especially what I've been hearing when I go throughout the state of Indiana is concerned election board members who are fighting disinformation, who are being bombarded with the request for more information because people are believing in these conspiracy theories about elections. And so I would continue to help them in the ways that they have been helped, but also a point of leadership, right? So again, I was so excited when I sat down with the clerks and talked to them because having come from one of the largest organizations in the world, the Department of Defense, I'm used to a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of red tape. And I love working with soldiers. So just like that, I would love working with the clerks and making sure that we are doing the best we can across all 92 counties and making sure that they have the best information and the most up-to-date technology available to them and best practices.
Thank you. Mr. Maurer, the same question about compliance for the 92 counties in terms of federal and state voting laws.
If we really truly want to help our clerks and give them the best information possible, we need to do an audit. And that's not to punish them or challenge them, that's to actually see how are we doing things and what could we be doing better. And that means looking at their processes, looking at their technologies, looking at their people, looking at their resources and saying, actually, you need more help and we need to give you more resources. That is the solution. That's the pathway forward. We need to know what to work on. Just like a father helping his son learn how to swing a baseball bat, we need to review the process and find ways to constantly make it better. And we're going to do that with a comprehensive risk-limiting audit of all 92 counties. That's the best way to understand where we're coming up short or where we can be doing even better with compliance for both state and federal regulations.
Thank you. Ms. Wells, would you like a 30-second rebuttal?
Yes, please.
Yes.
We don't help our county clerks by giving them more things to do. This 92 county audit may sound like a great thing, but if we would just do our jobs on the front end as secretaries of state, we wouldn't have to have 92 county audits. The audits are to catch mistakes, and a system shouldn't be riddled with mistakes. We should be able to have a system that functions the right way the first time around.
Thank you. And Mr. Maurer, 30 seconds for you as well.
That's wishful thinking, and we see it at all levels of government where there are audits and control boards and reviews of audits. So the reality is these 8 organizations are complicated and systems and processes are complicated. That's why we need to check it and review it. And only by understanding what's working and what's not working, that's how we're going to make it better.
Thank you. A tough study that came out right before the 2020 election showed Indiana with a steep drop in 18-year-old and 19-year-old registrants from 2016. What would you do to promote registration and turnout among the youngest Hoosier voters? And Mr. Maurer, we'll begin with you.
It comes back to choices. Our youngest voters are used to opening up their phones and having a world, a globe of choices on their phones. We can order pizzas online, we could pay our taxes, we can bank, we could trade cryptocurrencies on our phones. All of these things are possible. They're all choices on one small screen. And part of that frustration is when we go in to vote, we often have only one option, literally an unopposed candidate. And the best way to encourage voter turnout and participation and young people who are interested in voting for more, for voting for something, that's to give them someone to vote for, to give them more parties, more options, more candidates. Let's have some competition on our ballot.
Thank you, Mr. Maurer. Ms. Wells, the same question. What would you do to promote registration and turnout among the youngest Hoosier voters?
Well, we have to acknowledge history, and that is that in 2008, Barack Obama, when he was seeking to be president, was largely successful with young Hoosiers. He buckled down and he made sure that he tried to triple the registrations for the youth. What you saw after that was a concerted effort to limit access for youth to the ballot. Voting centers were moved off of campus. The transportation issues keep young voters from voting. And so what we need to be doing is, again, like I said earlier, is not being afraid of voters, not being afraid of the youth. They are our future. We have to be talking to them, asking them, what is your voting experience? How about a college advisory board with the Secretary of State? We have a brain drain in Indiana, and we need to civically engage our youth as soon as we can, and that is being registered and involved in the political process.
Thank you. This will be my last question before we go to our closing remarks. Ms. Wells, I'll start with you. Can you explain to all prospective voters that are watching tonight why you're the best candidate for this position?
I have gone throughout the state and talked about this position, and that it is an office that traditionally is technocratic and administrative. It is only after 2020 that we have seen Secretary of State's offices all across the nation be contested, specifically by election deniers. In Indiana, we have an election denier who is running with the Republican Party. This year, Hoosiers should be voting for the candidate that is pro-democracy. And I'm the only pro-democracy candidate on the ballot this year. I have said over and over tonight that we must be operating from a fact-based, evidence-based place. That is the only way I know to function. I have held a top secret security clearance for the last 16 years as a military officer. And it is with honor and pride that I operate from that perspective, from being evidence-based, from the facts. And I, again, like I said, am the only pro-democracy candidate for voters to choose from.
Thank you very much. Mr. Maurer, the same question for you. Can you explain to all prospective voters watching why you're the best candidate for this position?
Sure. My background, my career has been in finance and technology, and I managed a $300 million budget and worked very closely with internal audit to implement strong accounting controls. These are the good common sense tools that will give us the insight to know that our systems, our elections are performing as they need to. But let's address the 800-pound gorilla not in the room tonight. Healthy democracies need healthy debate. And candidates who refuse to debate are assuming that they've won the election and they don't even need to listen to you. There's a candidate who refused to debate in 2000, 2004, 2012, 2018. His name is Vladimir Putin. And for candidates who refuse to debate, the company you keep is Vladimir Putin.
To both candidates, I thank you. I apologize that we've run out of time for your closing remarks, but I felt that those responses were wonderful. And to the audience, I want to thank you all for joining us here this evening to hear the candidates for our Chief Election Officer, the Indiana Secretary of State. We particularly want to thank WFYI for producing and broadcasting this important debate, and affiliates and commercial stations for making it accessible statewide. Thank you so much for tuning in.
This program is made possible through the support of Indiana public broadcasting stations.